I'm David Remnick, editor of The New Yorker, and welcome to the New Yorker Summit. Our first speaker is the remarkable Malcolm Gladwell. Malcolm is my dear friend of, 20-odd years. We met at the Washington Post. His last story for the Washington Post that I remember when he was the New York bureau chief here was of a profile of a dog on death row. It's only gotten better since. He is the author of 3 books that you may have heard of that have sold more than any of Gideon's books, I think. The Tipping Point, How Little Things Can Make a Big Difference. Blink, The Power of Thinking Without Thinking. And his most recent book, Outliers, The Story of Success. He is going to talk now about how we should be thinking about the financial crisis, and he will then be followed by a series of discussions here on stage. Welcome, and I hope you enjoy.
Welcome, and glad you all could make it today. I bet you're wondering how it is that I got to go first, because going first, of course, is the great prestige position. It's when you get to set the intellectual tone for the day. That's not why I'm going first. I'm going first because I looked at the lineup of speakers and realized that every one of them knew way more than I did about politics and policy. So I begged Rhonda Sherman, who organizes the conference, that I could go first and get out of the way before the heavyweights weigh in, because this kind of thing is not suited to the sort of flim-flammery and digression that I am best suited for. So I am, as I always like to say, I am your amuse-bouche. Trust me, the entree is coming. I wanted to make a very simple and very narrow point about the financial crisis that we are in the middle of. And to suggest that once we understand the reasons for the crisis, we will understand just how difficult it's going to be to fix it and prevent another one. And I started thinking about this because I read the book House of Cards, which is out now by a man named William Cohan, which is an account of the fall of Bear Stearns, which at one point was the 5th largest investment bank on Wall Street. And the genius of this book is that Cohan basically sits down with Jimmy Kane, who was the CEO of Bear Stearns up until almost the end. And he just tape records him for hours and hours and hours. And Jimmy Kane turns out to be the kind of person who you're quite happy to listen to for hours and hours and hours. And so at one point, Cohan asked Kane to discuss a lawsuit that Bear Stearns had been embroiled in. And they had lost. It was an angry investor had sued the bank, and they had lost in the lower court and appealed to the higher court. And so this is Kane describing what happened on the day of the appeal. Now, I apologize in advance for the language of Jimmy Kane, but as I think you'll see, it's quite important for us to capture the flavor of his personality. So this is Kane on the lawsuit. Their lead lawyer turned out to be about a 300-pound fag from Long Island, a really irritating guy who would cross-examine me and tried to kick the shit out of me in the lower court trial. Now, when we walk into the courtroom for the appeal, they're arguing another case, and we have to wait until they're finished. And I stopped this guy. I had to take a piss. I went to the bathroom to take a piss, and I came back and I sat down. Then I see my blood enemy stand up, and he's going to the bathroom. So I wait until he passes, and I follow him, and it's just he and I in the bathroom. And I say to him, "Today, you're going to get your ass kicked big." He ran out of the room. He thought I may have wanted to get started right then and there. Now, let's put this in perspective. At the time Kane says this, he is 73 years old. Bear Stearns has just noisily and spectacularly collapsed, right? And one of the biggest failures, since the Great Depression. Kane has personally lost $1 billion. His reputation is in ruins, in large part because it comes out during the end of Bear Stearns that he spends the entire crisis period on a golf course in Long Island. And now he's in his office with a very respected financial journalist, and who wants to tell the full story of the collapse of Bear Stearns, right? Now, do we think that Jimmy Kane thought long and hard about how he wanted to make his case to William Cohan? Of course he did. Jimmy Cain was known for many years as the savviest man on Wall Street. He's a sort of master tactician. He's this brilliant guy who came up through the ranks at Bear Stearns because he was an extraordinary salesman. He had an ability to size up and read people and figure out their strengths and weaknesses and position himself in a way that made his case irresistible. In fact, he's one of the greatest bridge players in the world. And bridge, as you know, is a game that requires that people have the ability to make sense of their opponents and size up their opponents. And that's how he makes his case. So Cohen goes on and he starts to ask Cain about the final days of Bear Stearns. And Bear collapses because they run out of money, right? And their only hope is if the Fed opens up what's called the discount window, which gives them basically access to an unlimited line of cheap money from the government. But Timothy Geithner, who at the time is running the New York Fed, doesn't open the discount window until the day after Bear Stearns collapses, right? So Cain is asked what he thinks of Geithner. Now, picture the scene, right? You've got the journalist, the respected journalist in one chair with the tape recorder running. And in the other, across the table, you've got Cain, right? And Cain, you realize at this point, as you sort of have been reading through the book, you realize he's just told the story about the 300-pound fag from Long Island, but you get the sense that he is so sure of his abilities to size up Cohen, and so sure of how strong his case is, that he thinks he's got Cohen in the palm of his hand, right? So here is the savviest man on Wall Street as he sets out to salvage his good name by describing what his position is on Timothy Geithner. The audacity of that prick in front of the American people announcing he was deciding whether or not a firm of this stature and this whatever was good enough to get a loan, like he was the deciding factor. It's like a flea on his back floating down underneath the Golden Gate Bridge, getting a hard-on saying, "Raise the bridge." This guy thinks he's got a big dick. He's got nothing except maybe a boyfriend. Now, it strikes me that there are three ways to think about the crisis on Wall Street. The first way is to think of it as institutional failure. Right? There was a breakdown in the quality of the regulatory institutions that keep Wall Street running smoothly. That's sort of been the dominant paradigm that we've been using in the last couple of months as we wrestle with this problem of what to do about the banks. The second paradigm for thinking about what went on Wall Street is cognitive. It is that the people, the bankers on Wall Street who made all of these disastrous bets were over their heads. They didn't know enough, right? They made bets that they didn't really understand, and that was the problem at the end of the day, right? That they're not smart enough. Now, both of those paradigms have very clear and obvious solutions. If the problem is regulatory, you fix the regulatory system. If the problem is incompetence, then you find a way to weed out the incompetence, educate the rest, and make the whole banking system transparent in a way that makes it possible for people to make intelligent choices. Now, the problem is, though, that when you start reading books like House of Cards, William Cohen's book, you become convinced that neither of those two paradigms are really relevant, that what we're really talking about is something else, which is not cognitive failure or institutional failure, but psychological failure, right? That what happened on Wall Street is not the consequence of experts failing to act like experts, but rather the consequence of experts acting exactly like experts act, right? That what's going on Wall Street is not the result of incompetence, but rather of overconfidence. Now, the field that has taken this notion of psychological failure most seriously is the military. In fact, there's a huge amount of literature in the military on what it means to be overconfident and how different the roots of overconfidence are from the roots of incompetence. And as a really good example is the British campaign in Gallipoli in 1915. And those of you who will remember your World War I history will remember that Gallipoli is a peninsula that juts into the Aegean Sea in southern Turkey. And the British, Winston Churchill, has the bright idea that if the British are able to land a force on the Gallipoli Peninsula, they have a clear shot at Constantinople. They have a chance to bypass the stalemate on the Western Front, and they have a shot at the soft underbelly of Germany. the phrase soft underbelly, if you ever noticed, is only ever used with respect to Germany. It's this brilliant masterstroke that could have ended the war 2 or even 3 years early, and it fails. And the question that many military historians have wrestled with is why, right? Now, let's use our paradigms. Was it incompetence that caused the Gallipoli invasion to fail? No. The British were at the height of their powers. They were the dominant force in the world. And the commander of the Gallipoli campaign is a guy named Sir Ian Hamilton, who had distinguished himself in the Boer War as being really quite an extraordinary general. All right, so is it institutional failure? Right? Was there something wrong with the way the British Army was structured that made it impossible for them to successfully execute this campaign? No, not really. It actually had a pretty good structure. In fact, the only argument you can render against the British at Gallipoli is the attitude of commanders was too hands-off towards their people in the field, but that's actually what we now believe to be the best possible form of organization for the military. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is the British, when it comes to planning and executing that campaign, are incredibly nonchalant. It's as if they are completely deluded about the nature of the threat that they're facing in Gallipoli with the Turks, right? Taking Gallipoli required an amphibious landing, which the British had never really done before, and it required an attack against an enemy who was already entrenched in this wild terrain of ravines and thick underbrush and large hilltops. And yet, despite those extraordinary obstacles, the British never really put together a formal plan of operations. Originally, Lord Kitchener had suggested that they would need 150,000 troops to take Gallipoli. They end up sending 70,000. The original estimation is that they would need 300 guns, and they kind of blow it off and they send 118 guns, right? The key battlefield was on an area called Suvla Bay, and when the British first attack Suvla Bay, they have an advantage of 10-1 over the Turks who were there, and a chance to take over the highlands and really win the day. But that window of 10-1 advantage only lasts 2 days because the Turks are sending reinforcements. So what do the British do in that critical 2-day window? They lounge on the beach. They have cookouts and they smoke cigarettes and they go swimming, and the commander of the Suvla Bay forces sleeps in his ship anchored just offshore, right? And when Sir Ian Hamilton hears about this, he realizes, oh my goodness, we're squandering our opportunity, and he rushes to the scene. Only he doesn't actually rush to the scene because he's decided to make his headquarters on an island an hour away, and it takes him a couple hours to wrestle up a ship to actually take him to the scene of the accident, right? The British are extraordinarily overconfident in that moment. In fact, there's a great quote from Ian Hamilton's diary. In the days leading up to the attack, he writes, "Let me bring my lads face to face with Turks in the open field. We must beat them every time because British volunteer soldiers are superior individuals to Anatolians, Syrians, or Arabs, and are animated with a superior ideal and an equal joy in battle." Right? He thinks it's going to be no contest. Now, when we use that word overconfidence to describe the British attitude, we mean two very specific things. The first is what's called miscalibration. And miscalibration refers to the gap between how accurate your predictions are and how accurate you think your predictions are. Right? So if we ask a student what grade she thinks she's going to get in her calculus class, and she says, I am absolutely certain I'm going to get between an A and a B. If she ends up getting a B+, we say she is well calibrated. She has a good understanding of her own abilities, right? If she ends up failing the class, we say she's miscalibrated. And what the British were in Gallipoli was badly miscalibrated, right? They knew they ought to be the favorite in that battle, but they grossly estimated just how much of a favorite they were. Right? They thought it was a slam dunk, and it wasn't. It was actually a pretty tight race. They also suffer from what's called illusion of control, which is another common form of overconfidence. An illusion of control is where you become so confident that you think you have control over things that actually can't be controlled. You think that in addition to controlling things that involve skill, you also control things that involve luck or fate. Right? So the British they look at how they are vastly better than the Turks on paper, and they think that also means that they should have superiority over things like the weather or the terrain, which they have no control over. And they completely neglect to take into account the fact that their troops are going to be going in the attack directly into the sun, which blinds them and makes it very difficult to fight. And they completely forget the fact that the terrain on the Gallipoli Peninsula is profoundly different from the terrain on the Western Front, which makes for a very, very different fighting environment. Now, when you sort of look closely at those two different kinds of overconfidence, miscalibration and illusion of control, you begin to understand what a kind of thorny problem overconfidence presents to those who would want to fix it or be reformers, right? Incompetence is certainty in the absence of expertise. Overconfidence is certainty in the presence of expertise. It's the disease of people who are good, right? You get to be overconfident because you have had years and years and years of being legitimately confident. When we look for evidence of miscalibration in people, we find it overwhelmingly in experts. Doctors are among the most spectacularly miscalibrated people on the face of the earth. That's not because they're dumb, it's because they're smart, right? And when you look at those two things as well, you realize that the reason they are so commonly found in experts is that they are the product of conditions in which experts often find themselves. So we tend to see the illusion of control, for example, reach dangerous levels when people are under conditions of real stress, when they're in highly competitive conditions, and when they're in very complex conditions. And we begin to see that miscalibration becomes a real pronounced problem when people get older, when they get more experienced, when they're doing things that are really difficult, and when they are engaged in something that they feel very strongly about. Right? So the British were overconfident at Gallipoli, not because they didn't think Gallipoli was important, but paradoxically because they thought Gallipoli was really important. Because it was such a high-stakes contest, because it had such daunting complexity, it is exactly in those moments that overconfidence starts to take root. There's a very lovely study that was done by a psychologist called Marco Creevy. It's an illusion of control study, and he creates a computer screen that mimics the movement of the Dow over the course of the day, right? So that it just kind of goes up like this and this. And he gives all the subjects 3 buttons, and he says, you should press these buttons, and they may or may not help you raise the Dow, right, over the course. So use them all you want, and they may or may not help you make that Dow go higher. And he's going to reward them on the basis of how high the Dow is at the end of the experiment. So at the end of the experiment, he asked them, you know, how much of an impact do you think you had on the movement of the Dow? And they all say, oh, we had a huge effect on it. But of course, in the experiment, the buttons did nothing at all, right? They were just completely dummy buttons. Now, that sounds like a shocking result, but it shouldn't be. Why? Because who did he give the experiment to? He gave the experiment to highly trained professionals, to people who operate in environments that are stressful and difficult and complex and competitive, to people who spend their lives being rewarded and encouraged on the basis of their ability to exert some kind of control over random environments, right? These are the kinds of people who, if they sat next to you and were trying to convince you of something, would think they had you in the palm of your hand, right? He gave, I think you can tell where this is going, the people he gave that test to were Wall Street traders. So, back to Jimmy Cain. Jimmy Cain is the picture of overconfidence, right? That whole session with William Cohan is about illusion of control. I think I control what's going on in your mind, right? Just because I'm talking to you. That's a classic example of this kind of overconfidence in action. And when you look at Jimmy Cain's, his actions down the stretch with Bear Stearns, you see one evidence of overconfidence after another. Right? He famously gives an interview to the New York Times a couple of years before the bank's collapse, where he says, we're firing on 99 cylinders, and I ask myself, is there anything we can do better? And I can't come up with an answer, right? And in the critical last months, in Bear's final year, he refuses to raise any additional capital, which is clearly what the bank needs. And at one point, he increases, I think 6 months before the crash, he increases the firm's stock buyback program, which is, in the best of times, a waste of money, but he increases it from $2 billion to $2.5 billion. And when their 2 hedge funds collapse, which we now know to be the beginning of the death spiral for Bear Stearns, he and his top deputy, the day after they collapse, he and his top deputy, Warren Spector, go to Nashville for 10 days for a bridge tournament, and the entire time that they're there, they can't be reached by cell phone or email. Now, here, though, is where the overconfidence problem gets even thornier, because it is not just the case that overconfidence is promoted by the kinds of environments that that experts find themselves in. It's also the case that, to a distressing degree, overconfidence is required by the situations we put experts in, right? Think about how Wall Street banks operate. On an almost daily basis, they lend each other billions of dollars, right? And what is the basis of those loans? It's confidence, right? It's trust, right? That's how they send all this money back and forth. They have confidence that the bank can make good on it. And when Bear Stearns collapses, it's not because they've made a series of disastrous trades that lead them bankrupt. On the contrary, right up close to the end, they've got $17 billion in the bank, right? The problem for Bear was that when Jimmy Kane stood up near the end and said, we're firing on 99 cylinders, we're doing everything that we should, I can't think of how we'd be in a stronger position, people on Wall Street no longer believe him. The trust is gone, right? And clients start removing their money, and lenders start demanding more and more collateral, and the bank's financial position goes into this precipitous decline, right? Right at the very end, before Bear Stearns goes under, J.P. Morgan advances them a line of credit, and which is supposed to kind of alleviate their cash flow problems, which it does in a certain sense, but so much is the problem on Wall Street about confidence that the effect of that lifeline actually has the intended effect. It ends up making their situation even worse. And there's this lovely quote from a guy named Bill Bamber, another Bear Stearns guy who wrote a book about the fall, and he said, when we started the week, we had no liquidity issues, but because people said that we did have problems with our capital, it became true, even though it wasn't true when people started saying it. So we were forced to find capital to offset the losses we'd sustained because somebody decided we didn't have enough capital when we said we really did. So when we finally got more capital to replace the capital we'd lost, people took that as a bad sign and pointed to the fact that we'd had no capital and had to get a loan to cover it, even when we did have the capital, they said, when we didn't have it. Right? So it may have been an excess of confidence that gets Bear Stearns into trouble in the beginning, but it is a lack of confidence that does them in the end. Right? This is why evolutionary biologists, when they talk about why it is human beings are so persistently overconfident, they say it's because overconfidence is adaptive. It is actually a trait that has been enormously useful to us in terms of our evolution as human beings. Right? It's always a big advantage when you're in competition with someone to appear to be bigger and stronger than you actually are, right? Because that makes the likelihood of you being attacked by your opponent less, right? Now, winners, in other words, know how to bluff. Now, who is the best bluffer? It is the person, not the person who pretends to be bigger and stronger than they actually are. It's the person who actually believes themselves to be bigger and stronger than they actually are. Right? The miscalibrated bluffer is the best bluffer of all. So in the very end, Wall Street sees through Jimmy Kane's bluff. So what is his problem? Is his problem that he was overconfident, or is his problem in the end that he wasn't convincingly overconfident enough? Right? So but here's where the problem of overconfidence gets most difficult, because if overconfidence is individually adaptive, if it's good for individuals to appear to be stronger, to believe themselves to be stronger and better than they actually are, it's clearly, as the evolutionary biologists like to say, globally maladaptive. When one country bluffs, it has the effect of discouraging another from attacking them. But when every country bluffs, then you have a problem, because no one can accurately assess each other's strengths and weaknesses, and you end up with wars that are far more vicious and last much longer than they would have otherwise. I mean, the problem in the First World War wasn't just that the British were convinced they would roll over the Turks at Gallipoli. The problem in the First World War was that the British went in 1914 thinking that the Belgians would be able to stop the Germans, and that the Russians would rout the Germans in the east. Meanwhile, the French believed that within 6 weeks they would be at the Rhine, whereas the Germans believed that within 6 weeks they would be at the Seine. right? Absolutely every party in the First World War was bluffing. Just, of course, as absolutely every Wall Street executive in the last year and a half on Wall Street has been bluffing. And when everyone bluffs all at once, you have a problem, right? So what's the answer? Well, I'm going to leave most of those answers to the overconfident experts who are going to be following me. That's a joke. They're not actually overconfident. But let me just say this, that when we think about what it takes to fix the financial system, we need to remember that our goal is not to enhance the expertise of Wall Street. Expertise they have in spades. Our goal is to rein in the expertise of Wall Street, to protect ourselves that come from the particular set of highly problematic sociological issues that arise when you put highly qualified people in stressful, competitive, and complex environments. Wall Street needs to be slower, it needs to be less competitive, it needs to be a lot more boring, and it needs to be more conducive to proper calibrations of risk. And unless we do that, we're going to get another one of these financial crises sometime soon. Thank you very much.